Welcome to today's CAEF web talk in our series, Unapologetic Zionism. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation and today's moderator. Today we are fortunate to have as our guest, Christine Douglas-Williams, an author and commentator. I would like to thank Donna Holbrook, Canada's National Director of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, for their co-sponsoring of today's program. The Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is a registered Canadian charity engaged in educating Canadians about anti-Semitism, which masquerades as anti-Zionism, spreading lies and fakery about Israel, and thus attacking Jews in many ways that the world ignores. We urge all Jews and our allies to combat the many manifestations of anti-Semitism, including this most virulent form, anti-Zionism. It must be recognized that anti-Semitism is a three-headed monster. It lives on the extreme left, the extreme right, and Islamism. It is not innocuous, it is not humorous, it is not tolerable, and it is not isolated. It is in fact harmful, shameful, intolerable, and increasingly blatant. Examples in recent weeks abound, from an anti-Israel video posted on the Ontario Ministry of Education's e-learning center to the signboard outside a restaurant in downtown Toronto that said, "Zionists not welcome," to a Toronto Library acquisition of a self-published book by Eric Lowe titled Forgotten Conscripts, Prelude to Palestine's Struggle for Survival, which is filled with half-truths and a biased personal perspective devoid of proper footnotes. The epilogue is pure propaganda against Israel. CAEF works to counter the negative, dishonest narratives about Israel and provide the historical and legal truths about the rights of Jews to the land of Israel. The Jewish people are the original people and formed the first Jewish national home in ancient Israel millennia ago. Jews have legal rights to reconstitute the Jewish homeland in Israel as agreed to by the United Nations and confirmed in international law. As Jews, we need to know our history and acknowledge that Judaism has been Zionist for millennia, well before the late 19th century birth of political Zionism as a secular movement. We have looked to Zion and redemption in Israel throughout the ages. If we are to succeed in the battle of ideas and the preservation of democracy, we need to actively work on having all levels of government and all private and public institutions, including the media and universities, adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. We cannot allow others to decide what is an acceptable definition of discrimination against Jews. We must stand up against those who choose to use Israel as the new scapegoat for every one of nature's disasters or other people's destructive actions. Black Lives Matter cannot find support among Jews when it suggests Israel is training the US police to oppress Black Americans. The Women's March cannot find support among Jews when it states Zionists are not welcome. The environmental movement cannot and should not find support among Jews when the Green Party of Canada website calls for an end to the collective siege of Gaza so that medical and humanitarian aid can be provided. Not only has Israel removed itself from Gaza, but it never stopped humanitarian and medical aid from crossing into Gaza, whereas the Palestinian Authority this year stopped the delivery of millions of masks to its own people because the UAE delivered them in cooperation with Israel. As recently as this week, Hamas is sending rockets again into Israel, never missing an opportunity to be murderous and attack Israel rather than to serve its own people. One of our major goals is to help generate greater pride in Zionism, especially among our own young people, and learning about our history is one way. Another way is to hear from outspoken and ardent Zionists as to its true meaning and what we have to celebrate. One of our sincerest allies is Christine Douglas-Williams, who has actively supported Israel and will speak to us today about Christian Zionism. I'll introduce her in a moment. First, I'd like to encourage everyone who's listening and who's enjoyed our web talks to make a donation by going to the CAEF website. It's just caef.ca. And thank you for your support. And now everyone, your mics are off, but you're welcome to send questions via our Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Christine Douglas-Williams is a 9-time international award-winning journalist and television producer, conducting over 1,700 live interviews. She is a past federally appointed director with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and a former appointee to the Office of Religious Freedom in Foreign Affairs. Christine has authored hundreds of blogs, articles, and columns. Her writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Jewish Press, Breaking Israel News, the Middle East Quarterly, Front Page Magazine, Hudson Institute, among many other venues, and the Gatestone International Policy Council, at which she serves on the Board of Governors. Christine is a regular writer at Jihad Watch, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and has authored a monograph for the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. as part of its Civilizational Jihad series, titled Fired by the Canadian Government for Criticizing Islam, Multicultural Canada, a Weak Link for Islamization. She is also author of the book, The Challenge of Modernizing Islam, commissioned by the Middle East Forum. As a former on-the-beat political and crimes news reporter and newsroom editor, Christine has also worked as a regular national columnist and news analyst. She was also a senior advisor to the Hudson Institute in New York and is currently the Canadian Public Affairs and Media Consultant for the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. It is a very great pleasure for me to welcome Christine to present on Christian Zionism, loving Israel, and combating anti-Semitism.
Andrea, thank you. It's a complete honor to be here. Now, as a warning, I'm going to be moving ahead fast because I've got quite a bit of ground to cover. And my disclaimer to the more subtle type folks, I'll remain in keeping with unapologetic, the title given to me today, of which I'm perfectly happy to oblige. For starters, I'm going to define Zionism, Zionist, as given by the Encyclopedia Britannica, and ask you to please keep that in mind. Quote, a Jewish national movement that has had as its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state of Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews. Though Zionism originated in Eastern and Central Europe, in the latter part of the 19th century, it is in many ways a continuation of the ancient attachment of the Jews and of the Jewish religion to the historical region of Palestine, where one of the hills of the ancient Jerusalem was called Zion. Britannica defines Palestine as follows: the Eastern Mediterranean region, comprising parts of modern Israel and the Palestinian territories of the Gaza Strip, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and the West Bank, the area west of the Jordan River. Being unapologetic does not make friends. People start to call you divisive when you can equally call them divisive. But today, there's a stash of labels stored up, ready for launch when it suits an agenda. So we can expect opposition. Far too many have accepted the limitations of mediocrity or towing a more popular line that may be more acceptable to special interest groups, powerful lobbies, and even powerful states, hint, the OIC and its allies. Let's learn from history. In the days of the Nazis, the Jewish people as a whole, despite escalating hate, remained kind, friendly, lived in peace, lived by the rules and by the laws. In so doing, the prevailing thought among the Jewish community might have been, enemies will leave us alone. Well, they didn't. Hitler did not leave the Jews alone, and neither did the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini. If one claims to support human rights across the board and equality, justice, fairness, and equity, then why support that certain barbaric behaviors are acceptable for some people and some races, assigning to them a low standard, which I call a bigotry of low expectations, while holding a high standard for others, like the Jews, for example? Have the Jews not suffered through history, emerged from a fairly recent Holocaust, still face the worst discrimination according to stats? I personally believe, along with a lot of visible minorities that are ignored by mainstream activist media in an agenda-driven era, that there should be equal expectation for all. It is insulting to have a high expectation of one person or group and a low for another as a whole, and I'm unapologetic about that. You can likely deduce where I'm going with this. When I see what Jews in Israel are held to, not only a high standard, but an unreasonable standard by the global community, particularly the UN, something doesn't and shouldn't register right. An example, Human Rights Watch reported that Turkish border guards were opening fire on Syrian refugees indiscriminately who were seeking asylum from Syria, women and children included, just shooting them down and beating them. Why no outcry at the UN and from the mainstream media? Why pick on Israel at every turn? This should not be tolerated. Another issue now tragically unfolding given the disastrous explosion in Beirut. Since Hezbollah has been increasing government influence in Lebanon, there is reason to suspect that Hezbollah is behind those thousands of tons of explosive materials stashed in Beirut, enough to fully trigger off the damage of a small nuclear bomb if used to the max. As we know, Hamas stores weapons in hospitals, schools, and baby formula factories. Furthermore, in June last year, Hezbollah was uncovered by MI5 in Britain to be stockpiling tons of explosive materials, the same ammonium nitrate as in Beirut, on the outskirts of London in a secret British bomb factory. In Germany, Israel Intel notified Berlin of Hezbollah ops on German soil ahead of their recent ban on Hezbollah. Germany was alerted that Hezbollah stashed explosive materials in warehouses, as well as building money laundering networks. But these types of news items are either forgotten by selective memories or they quickly return to bashing Israel. Let's return for a moment to our Britannica definition of Zionism. Note the use of the word nationalist. That word has been hammered into the heads of everyone that it is somehow unique to Hitler or to his ilk. That notion couldn't be more wrong. Hitler was a socialist, the opposite of democratic and capitalist. He was the head of the German Socialist Workers' Party. But because he was a white supremacist and attempted to ethnically cleanse the Aryan race of Jews and blacks, the word nationalist became smeared and attributed to him, and now reserved to anyone who wants to protect Judeo-Christian democracies and fully support the state of Israel with Jerusalem as its capital. Decades before the Nazis turned on the Jews, German colonialists in southwestern Africa, now Namibia, dehumanized, built death camps, and slaughtered tens of thousands of tribespeople in systemic genocide. Then Hitler turned to the process of murdering Jews in the Holocaust. Very different from genocide, by the way. I had the opportunity to pose a question, an important one I deem it to be, to Professor Dan Meichman in 2011. He is the head of the International Institute for Holocaust Research with Yad Vashem. I asked him to please differentiate the Holocaust from other genocides. Eerie answer he gave. He said that the Holocaust was an attempt to, quote, exorcise the Jewish spirit from the world, unquote. This is precisely what Hitler's plan entailed, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, who did not want Jewish people returning to the Middle East and establishing a Jewish homeland. The al-Husseini vision persists to this day. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It is a well-known chant that means Israel must be obliterated from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea for Palestine to be free, otherwise known as a one-state solution. Now that represents supremacist Arab nationalism, much like Hitler's brand of Nazi nationalism. The Grand Mufti also led the Arab Revolt, and the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, was already planted in the area in the early 30s. But the term nationalism also has another meaning. It is when one espouses freedom, democracy, rule of law, equality for all, equity, and the vision is to actively protect under threat those values as laid out by a constitution under a flag, or also the pursuit of a rightful historic claim to a land such as Israel. Such references of nationalism are good, they're prudent, they're certainly not evil. Toddlers use overextensions, that's the term, overextensions, which is the use of a single word to describe multiple uses or meanings. I had a toddler once upon a time that's all grown up that would use the word ham to describe all kinds of meat. It's a similar kind of a situation. Nationalism has profoundly different meanings depending on usage. Back to the encyclopedia definition of Zionism, which refers to the Jewish national movement. This certainly is honorable. It's not wrong. It's not racist. There's no apartheid in Israel. Israel includes Palestinians in Knesset. Let's remember now that Abbas once said, in a Palestinian state, not one Israeli will exist. Now that is the wrong kind of supremacist nationalism. Zionism is a good nationalism. The return of Jews to Israel has seen Jewish tribes from China, from India, from Africa as well. You will not find a country that has so much diversity and celebrates it like Israel. What you don't hear in the news is how many Palestinians actually love Israel, depend on its democracy, depend on its employment there. SodaStream employees suffered greatly as a result of BDS, especially its Palestinian employees who are plentiful. Inside Israel with ICEJ Canada did a feature on that actually. I've had so many, in my experience, Palestinian cab drivers in Israel unload on me and say that the Palestinian Authority is horrible to the Palestinian people and that they are happy in Israel. Now the latest news says that the Palestinian Authority is actually arresting Palestinians who are vocal about supporting Israel's plan for annexation. There are a lot of people out there that will never imagine that, but yes, there are Palestinians that support Israel's plans for annexation, but the Palestinian Authority is cracking down on their voices. Racism can and does exist everywhere, but there are those who are out to confuse the discourse, destroy Israel, destroy Zionism, destroy the tiny allotment of land that Israel reclaimed in 1948, right after the devastating Holocaust to boot. No one claims Israel is perfect, no one is. But have you ever noticed how anti-Zionists and the majority of those in the anti-racism industry, not all, are consistently preaching against stereotypes, against labeling, picking on Israel at the UN, and so rampantly, and stereotypes about Jews are contrary to the sheer practice of equity, justice, and fairness, especially that Israel is not an abusing country, it's not apartheid, and abides by a free constitution, unlike the PA. But nobody talks about stereotypes when it comes to judging Israel and the Jewish people as a whole. The Palestinians are really Ottoman South Syrians, and the Balfour Declaration was aimed to settle the disputes, the revolts against the Jewish people's claim to their own ancient land, proven by archaeological finds. The Balfour Declaration, like most of you know, was a public statement issued by the British government in 1917 following the First World War, announcing support for the establishment of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people, hence the term nationalism again. Amid the invented nuances, it doesn't change the simple facts. One tiny state, amid vast Islamic territory, trying to survive in its ancient homeland, finally reclaimed, Israel is a modern day miracle, nothing short of. From a faith perspective, as Christians, the Jews are fundamental to Christianity. The Christian faith is hinged on the Jewish faith that is grafted in. Jesus is known as Yeshua, born of the house of David, as stated in Christian scriptures. In the Palestinian territory, on the other hand, it's being declared, and many don't know this, that Jesus was a Palestinian. Why? Because he was born in Bethlehem, in the PA-controlled Bethlehem. And that's what they say. But scripture says he was from the house of David. The Israeli monitoring agency, Palestinian Media Watch, exposed a Palestinian Authority interview which revealed that the late Yasser Arafat several times affirmed Jesus was the first Palestinian martyr, while the TV host replied, quote, Jesus was a Palestinian. No one denies that, unquote. Palestinian Media Watch also cited the regularity of this declaration by prominent Palestinians, including the governor of Ramallah, Layla Ghanem. Quote, we all have the right to be proud that Jesus is a Palestinian, unquote. Senior PA leader, Jibril Rajoub, quote, the greatest Palestinian in history since Jesus is Yasser Arafat, unquote. And an editorial in the PA official daily, Al Hayat Al Jadida, referred to the Holy Trinity as being Arafat, Abbas, and Jesus. So Jesus is lumped in with Abbas, who did his PhD dissertation in Holocaust denial. Yasser Arafat, who learned under the tutelage of his uncle, yes, his uncle, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Yasser Arafat, for those who may not know, was born Rayam Abdul Rauf al-Qudwa al-Husseini. He's family to the Grand Mufti, and he learned from him. Now, Christians have also made some grave mistakes historically, and we can't deny it, and I want to address that now. But historically, sadly, Many Christians also blame Jews for Jesus being crucified. Some sided with Hitler, blame Jews over the Bolshevik Revolution, blame Jews for George Soros et al. And it still goes on. The history of globalism, the issue currently of globalism, in fact, and the problems connected to open door immigration is blamed on Jews too because of George Soros, as if major globalists aren't non-Jews as well. So let's take a peek back to the Nazi era for a moment and Christians. The Nazi regime knew that Protestants in particular were divided into various denominations, unlike the Catholics who were under one umbrella, which to them translated to disunited. So the regime urged Protestants to unite all regional churches into a national church centralized under a well-known pastor, Ludwig Müller, a Nazi member. Imagine, he was appointed Reich Bishop. His following grew. In a national Protestant vote in July 1933, Müller won the national election to lead German Christians as bishop of the German Evangelical Church. Today, here's the problem. You still have Christian icons of propaganda, some that are deemed to be beyond reproach. For example, Nobel Prize laureate and retired Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu. He serves as patron of Sabeel International. Its head office is the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem. The organization represents the heartbeat of the anti-Zionist establishment in the church. It is in unison with the World Council of Churches, unfortunately, of which the WCC, in short, World Council of Churches, refers to occupied Palestinian territories and emphasizes Palestinian refugees displaced as a result of partition. The subtleties of anti-Semitism are very important and they shouldn't be ignored. This is what can be deemed insidious and creeping anti-Semitism. It is deceptive. It's friendly to your face, but sinks you. For example, the World Council of Churches claims it doesn't support BDS, but yet it mobilizes churches worldwide to support BDS campaigns through programs. It also calls on member churches to be, quote, more active agents, unquote, by, quote, promoting and supporting all nonviolent efforts to end the occupation, including considering appropriate economic and other measures that smile to your face, denial of BDS, yet promoting BDS. The WCC is also a central promoter of the Kairos Palestine document, heavily supported by Sabeel as well. This Sabeel stems from liberation theology, which began in South America as a good thing. In short, it was intended to exemplify the Christian faith in caring for the poor and the oppressed. And the essence of what you would call good social justice. Fast forward to South Africa. That was a clean-cut example of sheer racism, apartheid, and abuse. Thus, the Kairos document was born. Kairos document, very different than the Palestine one, and I'll get to that. The Kairos document was born pointing out the victims, South African Blacks, and the perpetrators, the South African leadership. That document went far in righting grave wrongs. But out of it, in 2009, was born another document, the deceptive document called the Kairos Palestine document, K-A-I-R-O-S, which characterizes the Palestinians as the victims. So armed resistance as Palestinian legal resistance. This is how it's cast, completely denying Jewish history, not only theologically, but even the right of the Jewish people to their homeland. Kairos Palestine mobilizes churches worldwide in a call for BDS. Back to the instrumental Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem. Desmond Tutu's role as patron is to, quote, assist the Palestinian Christian organization in its outreach and development work with Christian churches around the world. He has also stated that BDS helped to achieve South African democracy and that BDS will work toward ending Israel's decades-long occupation of Palestinian territory and the unfair and prejudicial treatment of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government ruling over them, unquote. Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize how this has been twisted, it's been turned, it's been warped into complete deception. He's influential and people believe in him. Does this mean we go along to get along? That's a question of conscience and carries grave implications to the state of Israel and to the ongoing rights of the Jewish people. Friends of Sabeel conferences continue to take place several times annually in major North American cities, where calls for BDS are sounded and where overcoming Christian Zionism and a quest for justice and seeking the peace of Jerusalem is a major theme. That includes a collaboration with an event called, and this needs to be noted, they have a plan on their website for 2021 as well. It's called Christ at the Checkpoint. As the name implies, the image of a Palestinian Jesus at an Israeli checkpoint is precisely the image being cast. A central focus of that conference is the propaganda that the Palestinians are being abused, and they compare it to Jesus. It was even compared to Jesus on the cross. No mention of the defense factor when it comes to Israel. No mention of the historic claim. It is a huge evangelical event that is not being challenged, not nearly enough. Too much fear and tolerance of the intolerable. Not enough unapologetic Zionism. This conference can be defined as advancing the new anti-Semitism tailored for evangelicals. And that was the name of an article I wrote for the Gatesville Institute. In 2014, in what was dubbed an unprecedented advisory, Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a warning to Christians to steer clear of Christ at the Checkpoint conference in Bethlehem. It coincided with Israel Apartheid Week there. And Israel Today, a publication that investigated the conference, concluded that it could pose a long-term threat to Israel's security. According to the official statement, which I think will interest you, of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this is how Christian Zionists feel as well. So we stand in unison with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel. Quote, the attempt to use religious motifs in order to mobilize political propaganda and agitate the feelings of the faithful through the manipulation of religion and politics is an unacceptable and shameful act. Using religion for the purpose of incitement in the service of political interest stains the person who does it with a stain of indelible infamy. Unquote. How I wish that were the case. The BDS Church collaboration with the interests of the Palestinian Authority is obscene. It's presented as fair, but its very name, its associations and proclamations says otherwise. And it affects the political establishments of the West as well. We cannot ignore it. We should never justify it in any shape or form. Is anti-Zionism the same as anti-Semitism? Absolutely. And I say so unapologetically. Is criticism of Jews and Israel anti-Semitic? Absolutely not. But presenting a message to unfairly and inaccurately demonize the state of Israel as an occupier and a barrier to peace with no fair consideration of history and the Charter's bent on obliterating Israel is plain wrong. It cannot be justified. In my book, The Challenge of Modernizing Islam, there's a chapter called The Israel Factor. The Muslim reformists interviewed in the book, in part, all have stated that they believe in Israel's right to exist. In part one, in fact, that's what I meant to say. The second part of the book is analysis. Now, I want to make a point here, and the point is not to boast, because I'll tell you the point. This book has also, and it surprises me, it's also available in parts of the UAE and even in Qatar. I'm surprised at that, and in northern Nigeria at American University. And it's in major university campuses like Harvard, like Princeton, Stanford, across the board, in libraries. It's coming to Canada too. It's at McGill, at my home university, McMaster. So that kind of surprises me, because particularly dealing with the Israel factor, that chapter on what the Muslim reformists have said, knowing how controversial that is. And in fact, how controversial the whole issue of Islamic reform is across the board. It's highly debated, and it's not the subject matter today, so I won't go along about it for long. But Islamic anti-Semitism is undeniably an issue. So these are the people that I interviewed in the book face to face, and I'll make a quick run through here. Raheel Raza, who many of you know well, Dr. Zudi Jasser, who most of you have heard of, Sheikh Dr. Ahmed Subi Mansour, who was the founder of the Quranist sect in Egypt, Dr. Tawfiq Ahmed, Dr. Salim Mansour, Dr. Kanta Ahmed, Dr. Jalal Zuberi, and Shireen Qudosi. They all agree that supporting Israel's right to exist is a litmus test to determine whether you're a friendly, Western moderate, and a reformist. But there is another issue that I want to present later on as part of the question, does Israel have a right to exist? I'll go to that later on. But the biggest argument I got before I embarked on the chapter, the Israel factor, and not from the participants, interestingly, but this was the argument I was hearing, that you don't have to be a Muslim at all to not believe in Zionism and Israel's right to exist. So how can you put this on Muslims? My answer, Muslims have a unique history with Jews, with Israel. And among Islamists, there is an ingrained hatred against Jews, a persecution of the very state of Israel, and the persecution of Christians rooted in Islamic supremacy. Reformists are against that by their very definition. Now, I'm talking reform in the right direction. There are those who use the word reform in the other direction, reforming Islam back to the days of Puritanism in the days of Muhammad. Reform toward modernization was my clear definition of reform. Urshad Manji once told Canada's Globe and Mail something very interesting, that, quote, offending people may be the only way to achieve a pluralistic society, unquote. She was right. We need to ask questions no matter how offensive. Some insights. When I posed a question about the Palestinian issue, I'm going to quote Raheel Raza for one. I chose a few. Quote, "It is absolutely manipulated by Islamists," she says. "The uneducated village guy in Pakistan will burn his shirt and give his life for Palestine. And if you ask him where it is on the map, he has no clue. It is also as an used as an instant political firestorm anytime. When I speak about women's rights in Islam, they will try to derail me by bringing in the Palestinian-Israeli issue. I have caught on to their trick," she says. "Anywhere you go in universities, the Muslim student associations are very radicalized, instantly throw you off the target by speaking about the Palestinian-Israeli issue. It is a huge bait, and people fall for it," unquote. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser gives much insight, saying, quote, "Normative Islam is what comes out of Al-Azhar University and Saudi schools, which is the majority of what is being taught. It needs tons of reform." This is a rather controversial statement because a lot of Muslims don't agree with this, but this is what he says. He goes on, "Yes, Saudi Arabia has been working with us against Al-Qaeda, but they created that monster. A lot of ideas that were established by bin Laden are still being spread by leaders in Saudi Arabia. All of these programs in Saudi Arabia for deprogramming terrorists tell them that violence is not the way. It does not tell them that their core Islamist Salafi ideas are wrong, and that will never happen," unquote. Zuhdi goes on that support for Israel is a key litmus test, unquote. Dr. Tawfiq Ahmed, who left Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, warned that Islamists can lie about their belief in Israel's right to exist, and that a better litmus test in their justification for attacking Israeli civilians. That's a better question, he says. He says, "I'm a typical Arab Egyptian with a Muslim background. As any Arab, I was brought up on hating Israel and the Jews. When I was 4 years old, the dehumanization of Jews everywhere around me led me to imagine them as green, ugly people full of evil," unquote. Now, an important question, I believe, to unapologetically ask anyone, aside from also looking at how they justify violence or even tolerate it, I believe an unapologetic question is, if you claim to be a Zionist, is this: do you support the armistice line, the pre-67 borders? How logically, if you think about it, can anyone truly support the right of Israel to exist and not support its rights to defend itself from obliteration? This is a determining question. Also, the pre-67 borders gives the PA control over the Jordan River, which supplies at least a third of Israel's water supply. The PA wants to see Israel destroyed. It's no secret. The two-state solution came and went under the League of Nations. The PA seeks a one-state solution from the river to the sea. Another point that I cannot let get away. The Palestinian resistance has now joined Black Lives Matter. As we heard before we started my portion, it was described well. And it was pointed out that how could Jews support Black Lives Matter, when you think about it, and I'm glad that was brought up. These two groups do not remotely support, by the way, what Martin Luther King was about. Martin Luther King was a minister. There are criticisms of him, of course, like any human being, and somebody is always digging up something, but he made a historic speech that basically everybody knows about called I Have a Dream, which encompasses human rights. It encompasses unity. He supported the nuclear family by his nature and by his life, and he supported progress in harmony. Even in his day of wretched racism, he did not support violence. He would have been dancing in his grave to see the concept, not necessarily the character, but the concept outside of partisanship of a Black president. Moving over now to the Canadian BDS Coalition website. It states, it believes in ending racial inequality, and that's how it's presented. Thus, we support and stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, unquote. Also in Gaza, the swastika has been raised repeatedly, but Hamas has now cracked down on that practice. Why? Because it isn't good for optics. It isn't good for the propaganda show. Goodness gracious, if truth comes out. Now, ICNA, the Islamic Circle of North America, has combined with Black Lives Matter on a project. Billboards were seen across the Sacramento area. And quote, and these are what's on the billboard, "We the people can't breathe, stop the racist killings," unquote. ICNA was also listed as an unindicted co-conspirator to jihad terror linked to Hamas in the largest terrorism financing case in the history of the United States, the Holy Land Foundation trial. Alarming. And ignoring these tidbits, because there's a whole lot more where that came from, or appeasing it won't help, it'll only grow. I'm detouring to Europe briefly. It's sad what's going on there in France. The World Zionist Organization is currently working on a plan to bring Jews home to Israel because of violent anti-Semitism attributed to jihad and to Islamism, of course, along with the rest that you get on the far right, and also on the socialist side as well, linked to open door immigration for the Islamist factor. In Germany, even Angela Merkel admitted to the same, although authorities in Germany have been falsely tallying Islamic anti-Semitic attacks to right-wing anti-Semitism. Quote by Merkel herself, because she was interviewed on an Israeli TV show. This is what she said, quote, "We now have another phenomenon, as we have refugees or people of Arab origin who bring another form of anti-Semitism into the country," unquote. Back to our continent now. Another news story comes to mind that incorporates important abstract material that circulates in separate contexts, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because it has nuances that I think are very important to address. In a broad-ranging interview on Judaism, actor and comedian Seth Rogen said, "The reason for Israel's existence makes no sense, and the notion of a Jewish homeland to safeguard the Jewish people was comparable to putting them in a blender." Rogen also said anti-Semitism today was pervasive and prevalent. He admitted that. He also said, quote, "It would be nice to live somewhere which was not a part of Christian apocalyptic prophecy. Maybe settle somewhere. The Christians don't think you'll have to die in order for the apocalypse to occur," unquote. Rogen's comments are loaded, and they feed into true division, anti-Semitism, even though he rightly acknowledges anti-Semitism. Let's dissect the implications of this popular figure who has enormous influence. First, his comment about the notion of a Jewish homeland to safeguard the Jewish people, calling it comparable to putting them in a blender, I find rather offensive. It's very troubling, as you could see, though unintentional. It parallels a quote from Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, who also stated, quote, "If they Jews all gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide," unquote. Nasrallah pushes for the one-state solution, and his belief is, quote, "Palestine is an occupied land from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, and this is the right of the entire Palestinian people, this land," unquote. Does that man get held to accountability? Goodness, no. On the scriptural side of things, which is important to Christians, Isaiah 11:12 states, the Hebrew Bible version, "And he shall raise a banner to the nations, and he shall gather the lost of Israel, and the scattered ones of Judah he shall gather from the four corners of the earth," unquote. On the logical side of things, The Jews should not be giving up on a homeland out of fear, and Israel has lots of friends despite much necessary focus on enemies. Now for Rogan's view of Armageddon, dangerous and inaccurate. Armageddon figures prominently in the book of Revelations, yes, but let's be clear, Christians do not and have never looked to the destruction of the Jewish land of Israel in any way that is insinuated by Rogan. It is Iran that seeks the utter destruction of Israel and a global Armageddon to bring about the return of the Mahdi. Christianity celebrates at its core peace and life. Iran is a culture, celebrates a culture of death and hate and conquest. But it is true that Christianity prophesies a great time of trouble upon the earth overall. And there's also specific mention of the persecuted church in Revelations and God's special love for it, as there is for the Jewish people. Does this mean Christians support Christian persecution? Absurd, of course not. And Christians certainly do not seek the death of Jews to bring about what's in scriptures, the Old and New Testament. Unapologetic Zionists love Israel, love the Jewish people. Aside from Revelations, prophecies about Armageddon are also heavily alluded to in Joel 3:2, Joel 3:12-14, Zechariah 14:2, and Daniel 11:40, and that's just part of it. Now, there are categories of Zionists that I've personally observed. Emotional Zionists and religious dogma Zionists. They think it's the right thing to do. Some know little about why they're Zionists, but they are anyway. It's based on a strong faith in biblical Zionism. Some know lots about that, some don't, but they love Israel. They love the Jewish people. Hey, that's good enough for me. And you see it with not all, but many members of CUFI, and we see it with the ICEJ organization, just belief in the gospel. They know Jewish people, they love Jewish people, and they have the common sense, of course, to realize the Jews aren't the ones trying to destroy people in this world. Even facing a Holocaust, they don't scream victimhood. They built a state based on peace, based on ancient inheritance. So this is enough. Yes, we can go on and learn and learn. Some do it, some don't. But if you're an unapologetic Christian Zionist, believing in your faith, hey, that's good enough for me personally. Now, they're closet Zionists. Among this category are scared Zionists because they don't want to appear disagreeable. They're horrified at the thought of confronting enemies, dealing with enemies, dealing with verbal attack, no matter how subtle. So they oftentimes at various levels go along to get along, if even confronted face to face about their beliefs. In such an event, being silent, if you're confronted and you're apologetic, you're sheepish, especially if you have political influence, it inadvertently helps perpetuate the propaganda and leaves anti-Zionists believing that they're, in the right, and they're not, and that Zionism has little support. And that's not true. Zionists need to show the spirit unapologetically. Now, there are those who are also career Zionists. They do the job in the name of politics so that if a better bidder presents itself, they waver. They don't come right out and state that they oppose Zionism. And we discuss some of these issues off the top with certain people that claim to support Israel, yet they support BDS on the other hand. I mean, you get that across the board in every faith, but these are career Zionists. They don't come right out and state it, that they oppose Zionism, they oppose the state of Israel, and they're quite dangerous because they don't quite oppose it. But they pad their views, they package their views with a marketing precision. They make it look like they're trying to be fair, but take heed. They could never answer questions about the Grand Mufti and Hitler. Only Hitler, because of the popular politics of going after white supremacists, the current popularity of identity politics and a climate of political correctness. They would and could never answer questions about why in 1948, why in 1967, why in 1973, why the inclusion in the original PA, Hamas, Fatah charters to obliterate Israel, why the pay-for-slave program and the tolerance of it, why the anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian fervor connected to Iran, to Al-Qaeda, to the Muslim Brotherhood, to Turkey, the OIC as a whole, and why the chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and why the relentless attacks on Israel at the UN, but the ignoring of Christian persecution and the persecution of the Jewish state of Israel. It's disgusting to see what's tolerated. and to demonize a peaceful state of Israel. A genocide is also underway in Africa, by the way, but the world remains indifferent, as it does persecution of Christians in the Middle East. There are also circumstantial Zionists all over the map. It looks something like this. Well, did you see what the IDF did today? Did you see what George Soros did today? Okay, I'm on the Palestinian side now. I mean, of course, that's a complete exaggeration, but when one is not grounded in unapologetic Zionism, they're prone to propaganda and they're prone to be swayed. And I did give a simplistic example. There are more complex ones, but I wanted to make that point about circumstantial Zionists. All while ruthless conquests never come up, nor does Christian persecution, the historic oppressive Roman Empire. They weren't Jewish. Neither were the Egyptians, who actually held Jews as slaves. So why always the Jew, and why the focus on conspiracies? What about Stalin, Mussolini, Mao Zedong, Idi Amin? Why always look for the Jewish boogeyman? This is unacceptable. And there needs to be an unapologetic approach to Zionism, period, non-negotiable. It's fair, it's just, it's based on truth, and it's based on human rights and conscience. Closing soon, but I'm going to look to Canada for a bit here. My heart dropped, as did my jaw, when it came out that Trudeau had broke with tradition in the quest for a UN Security Council seat, which he didn't get anyway. And quoting CBC, quote, Canada breaks with recent history by voting against Israel at the UN. Now, this particular resolution, and this needs to be noted very carefully for those who justify or they're on the fence when it comes to Zionism. The resolution urges an end to the Israeli occupation. So although Palestinian self-determination is mentioned, and that sounds fair and it sounds harmless, ending Israeli occupation is an unacceptable reference. In 2010, a huge hope presented itself in Canada. I was really proud back then. This was under Harper. And I'm not saying this to be political, but this is what happened here. Parliamentarians and experts from 50 countries and 6 continents assembled together for a conference on combating anti-Semitism in Ottawa, where the Ottawa Protocol was released. In it was the groundbreaking alarm against state-sanctioned anti-Semitism and the resurgence of anti-Jewish libels, including Holocaust denial. The conference was hosted by the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism, and it was the largest of its kind ever. Delegates explored data to learn about and discuss strategies to combat anti-Semitism globally, and Canada's then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, affirmed that, quote, those who would hate and destroy the Jewish people would ultimately hate and destroy the rest of us as well, unquote. How I wish the Ottawa Protocol could be revived. Unfortunately, I have not heard it brought up in major circles, and I have had the experience of bringing it up once, and it was just kind of brushed aside. This needs to be revived, this needs to be a model, and it needs to be followed. Now, I want to end on a more positive note. As a Christian Zionist, it's encouraging to know that Jews have many friends in the Christian community, not pretend ones, not those who would waver, but unapologetic Zionists. You see it frequently with the energy, as I mentioned, with Kufi, with ICEJ, and ICEJ brings in the single largest tourism event annually in Israel via its Feast of Tabernacles. And these are enthusiastic Christian Zionists who are full supporters of Israel and the Jewish people. Now, if you're Jewish and you hear the words repeated by Christians that the Lord will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel, of course nobody wants to be cursed, but don't be offended. The intent isn't selfishness. Christians of all stripes have faith that God of Abraham of the Bible knows what he's doing. So therefore, if he will bless a certain action, it must be a good thing. Supporting the Jewish people is deemed to be a serious thing and a good thing by Christians, biblical Zionists, and it must be serious if the Lord will curse you if you don't bless Israel. So take it in the best possible way. Among Christians are also found some enthusiastic supporters of Israel and Jews, and that you'll meet. Now I'm going to have to deviate a bit here to go back to Theodor Herzl, because it's important to mention that his mentor was the Reverend William Heckler, deemed as an unsung hero, who also played an important role in helping to recreate the Jewish homeland. Herzl, in fact, called Heckler a Christian Zionist due to his great love for the Jewish people and determination to see Israel restored. Heckler was both concerned about the prophetic and the political ramifications relating to Israel. Finally, there are consequences of not accepting unapologetic Zionism. We see it disturbingly unfolding daily. And as a final note, please remember what I'm pretty certain just about all of you learned in grade school. You don't make friends with bullies by apologizing. You make stronger bullies by doing that, and more bullies who see you as weak and mount and launch against you. Being an unapologetic Zionist is righteous. It is synonymous with pro-Semite, the active opposite of anti-Semite. It is to support and defend the rights of the Jews as a people, and follows that Jews unapologetically have the right to their Jewish state of Israel. And I'll end on that positive note.
Wow, thank you. Fantastic. I am so encouraged, Christine. I wish I was there to give you a big hug. As I'm
virtual hug, virtual hug, Andrea.
I have a few questions. Some of the questions that I had intended to ask you really answered extremely well. So let me just ask you to start the conversation, two things. First of all, why do you personally feel so strongly? What in your life has brought you to loving Israel and loving Zionists?
I'll start on the note of Israel first, and then I'll move back to in time. Israel is a peaceful nation. It has come up, and this is rather logical. If Israel threw down all its weapons, what will happen? If Hamas, Fatah, all of the Arab states that have attacked Israel since 1948 threw down their weapons, what will happen? Now, both carry ramifications. We know Israel will be obliterated. The threat is still there. It's still in the charter. It is disgusting to me to see the threat against Israel, and visiting that country and seeing the diversity there, and seeing how the Palestinians also smile and they're celebrating there, and see the propaganda internationally, and see the lies, and ignore the real profound evils of the world, and point to the Jews and point to Israel. I find it absolutely intolerable. Now, going back in history, when I grew up, I suffered racism. And I do not ascribe, as I mentioned earlier, this bigotry of low expectations. When I was a child, I was one of the few, we grew up in Hamilton, one of the few visible minorities. I remember standing on a street corner looking for a bus with my sister and saying, oh, there's a black man over there. Oh, there's an Indian over there. Because they popped up over time as multiculturalism and diversity started to spread. But the thing is, I understood what racism was about. I understood what targeting was about. And what it did is that it instilled in me a value of justice, to look to the good, to support it, and stand up to it. Yes, I got into many, many alleyway fights. I have to admit, I was a really tiny kid, but I fought bullies in those days. I had no choice, because either that or you get beaten in the schoolyard. Well, I put up a fight, and I believe in fighting for what is right. It doesn't have to come down to defense where somebody comes up in your face physically, like we see Israel threatened by its surrounding enemies. Now, we pursue peace as Christians, as scripture says, with all people as much as possible with you. And people forget that part. So this is what drives me. It's personal experience. It's a zeal for justice. It's believing in the gospel. So it's a whole host of various components that drive me the way I'm driven when it comes to supporting Israel, and even being anti-Islamist, although I get accused of all kinds of things. It's another story.
I'm sure. Thank you. I want to make just one comment before my next question, and that is, and I hope you won't mind, but because you used the word annexation, and CAEF is very sensitive to correct language, as you have been through your whole presentation, I think it's important for me to say that we would talk about Israel extending its rightful sovereignty over land it owns, and it would not be annexation. Do you agree?
I fully agree. I fully agree. I just
Wherever
know that's the term.
we
Right.
will extend its sovereignty. Okay.
Right.
My question, given that you covered a lot of the different facets historically and current about Christians, Christianity, denominations, etc., what would you say to Jews who would like to reach out to Christians, who would like to find partners, allies, organizations that maybe ICEJ isn't everywhere? What would you tell us to do?
I would say, in my own experience with friendships, close friendships with Jews, knowing about Jews, Jews by nature seek knowledge. Okay, and I'm not saying other people don't, but I find that this is characteristic of Jewish people and something very positive, the seeking of knowledge. Hence, you see the inventions, you see the Nobel Prizes in science across the board and so forth. So I would say, seek partnerships, it's important. If you notice, the Palestinian Authority is doing it in spades. It's important for people to understand who you are. The Jews are peaceful, loving people. Now, I'm not saying every single one. You don't find that in every race or in every group of people, of course not. But as a whole, the Jews are a peaceful people. But beware and understand what's going on. Because you do have people, like I am certain there will be people going to Christ at the checkpoint that really believe this propaganda. How are they to be untaught this propaganda unless they have friendships with fellow Christians who know better and with Jews who know better? Because it is the Palestinian-friendly outreach that is garnering friendships. My advice would be to reach out, get to know the Christian communities better, understand them, and dialogue with them. This is very important, but be knowledgeable who you're speaking to and what their agenda is. Because among evangelicals, you find biblical Christian Zionists who will be friends to Israel, friends to Jews, and you find the others that will go to Christ at the checkpoint who have the best intentions and they believe what they're doing is right, but they're wrong. And this means even more that Jews, as well as Christian Zionists overall, need to reach out. The information needs to be known, but they also need to reach out and try to foster a sense of harmony with others.
Thank you. I'm going to give you one comment that we've got and then one last question. So first of all, from John Thompson, who we would like to say hello to, he points he points out that there are so many genocides that are being ignored, human rights abuses around the world, and you, as you rightly said, being totally ignored. I have sent messages to many of my Christian friends when I read about the massacre of Christians in Africa, saying, what is your church saying? And nothing comes back.
I have to agree, and I have a few points to make on that. That is a sore spot for me. Now, I know that there are many Christians that they believe in having, and I'm not putting them down, I'm just saying they're different types of personalities. They believe in just being quiet about everything. The Lord will take care of everything. But there's also faith without works is dead. And sometimes I have to tell people, I am a whip of cords kind of a Christian. You've got both the turn the other cheek. You also have the whip of cords. And I'm not advocating the whip of cords everywhere you go, but I'm advocating justice. And Christians, I think, have a responsibility to bring up these issues to their pastor. Just last week, I had an extended family member bring up the issue that the pastor was talking about. You would not believe what the pastor was talking about on what has become characterized today as the far left, anti-Zionism, anti-everything that we stand for in terms of justice and righteousness. We need to stand up. Now, I know that a lot of people say, well, it doesn't get discussed in churches because it's political. Yes, it does, because the World Council of Churches is very vocal about its BDS. And so is Christ at the Checkpoint, all these organizations. They just bring up a certain kind of politics that is acceptable today, but they don't want to deal with the other kind, which is also religious and in righteousness. So what John is saying is true. I find it, if this does not really hit a sore spot with you, I would say something is wrong. You've got your head in the clouds, because this is important. Also, and this isn't known, I had the opportunity, something is being done, and I don't want to let that go away, because I like to raise positives when it comes to Christian persecution, particularly in the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Syria. The Hungarian government had an event that I attended, and it was an annual Christian persecution conference. Across the board, from Africa, the Middle East, leaders attended, archbishops attended, church leaders attended, and what often people don't know is that millions of dollars are being spent between the Hungarian government and the American government to help Christians in the Middle East. That gets buried because people like to label people nationalists, you're evil, you're this, you're that. The same thing they do to Israel. Who responded immediately in Beirut? Israel. Who responded in Haiti? Israel. But nobody wants to hear the good news when they have an agenda. they bury it. And the media today has become activist media. We have a responsibility as a church to go and let our voices be heard to the pastors. If they're upset, they're going to be upset anyway. Look to the example of Christ. He didn't care who he upset. He was a man of truth, the spirit of truth and righteousness.
Thank you. So from Goldie, the question I will end with, since you're now added to her list and my list of heroes like Nikki Haley, what are your political intentions? Can we expect at some point we'll play a role in politics?
I am open. Let's put it this way. I have found in my life, you know, if many of you have understood the politics of economics, Friedman's invisible hand. I have noted the invisible hand, and I know my Christian friends that are watching will say it's the Lord, and I believe that. I have been led into many domains, and if I am ever led into that domain, I will not say no. I will go with it. As it stands now, I edit, I write, I speak, but if it came up in the political domain, I will enter that door. But it troubles me today what we see in our own camp, toleration of the intolerable. This is what we see, and that troubles me, and that has kept me from entering that direction. But it does not mean that an opportunity may not present itself.
Okay, well, on that note, we wish you well. We thank you on behalf of CAEF and ICEJ and everybody today, and really on behalf of the Jewish people. Thank you for speaking out and being our friend and ally.
Thank you, Andrea. Great organization. Thank you, everybody.
Bye for now.
Bye.